Thank you very much. Well, like Melissa, I'm a historian of 19th century gender in Australia. My project looks at the forgotten phenomenon of colonial businesswomen in 19th century cities, and I'll use Sydney as a case study. My project uses the newly available digitised resources of archival sources like newspapers that you can now search, and it means it's brought to light a new way of looking at Sydney's past and particularly women's role in it. So traditionally, memorials and feminist historians have celebrated 19th century women's role as domestic wives and mothers. And indeed it was an important role. Most women were married and most had anything from between 6 and 14 children, which makes me kind of want to vomit. But anyway. And it is true that when they look at business, they say, oh yes, there were a few women in business, but it was mainly as a stopgap measure, or it was just pin money, just something extra. And it's true that employment options for women were limited. Most women were domestic servants if they worked at all, and there were no women doctors or lawyers. Women didn't go to university until the middle of the century, and women didn't even have the vote. Not only that, because most women married, they then became subject to the law of coverture. And this meant that basically they disappeared into their husband's identity, which meant that they couldn't make contracts, they couldn't go into debt, and they couldn't chase their creditors without their husbands, and they are all things that you need to do if you're in business. So you would think that this would be not surprising that there weren't very many women in business, and most sources support this, except when you start looking. So the trade directories give you a slightly different view. They're like the telephone books of the 19th century, where you have the name and the street and an occupation listed. And when you look in the trade directories, you see a few milliners and a few publicans that are women. But you can't trust the trade directories, because in 1858 there's a listing for William Robson in Pitt Street, and he's a milliner and dressmaker. And I thought that was a bit odd. So then I went to the newspapers, which have been digitised so I could search for them, and I searched for his ads, and lo and behold, it wasn't him, it was his wife, Mary Ann. Not only that, she'd been running that business since 1840, when she'd emigrated as a single woman. And it continued into the 1860s. So basically you have a business that in the trade directory looks like, oh, just another business run by a bloke. And it turns out to be a 20-year business that supported a woman as a single woman, and then was the main source of income during her marriage as well. And I discovered this, that these women, they just kept on popping out of the woodwork whenever I started looking. So in the end, I actually estimate that around about 20% of businesses in Sydney in the middle of the 19th century were actually run by women, either alone or with their husbands. So this project has produced a number of articles so far and a book. And in this book, I talk about some of the things that women were doing. So what were they doing? Yes, there were the needleworkers, the milliners and the dressmakers. There were also the midwives and monthly nurses, and the runners of ladies' academies of varying descriptions. There were also publicans and boarding house keepers, and the brothel keepers, of course. And then there were also butchers and bakers, and there were, I can't remember, lots of other things, including a taxidermist and someone who ran a circulating library, and a wonderful woman, Madame Sibley, who was a phrenologist, and she used to travel around giving shows where she would feel your skull and tell your character for a price. She made quite a lot of money. So why are these women important? They're important for two main reasons. First of all, they give us a new insight into the importance of small business in the creation of the city of Sydney and other colonial cities. After all, these women were running tiny businesses, just like most other businesses in Sydney that were run at the time by men or women. They were all small. And individually, they're quite insignificant. But when you take them together, they're actually the lifeblood of Sydney. They're equally as important as the major manufacturing firms that we remember. The second important thing is it gives us a new way of looking at women in the past. It gives us a different role model from that lovely wife and mother, woman's places in the home. Women did have an important reproductive role in the 19th century, but they also had an important productive role. These were the women who, all together, they educated, they entertained, they fed, they clothed, and they bedded the citizens of Sydney. Now, when you walk down Pitt Street and look up in Pitt Street Mall, you'll see this lovely facade of E. Way & Co, and the plaque will tell you about the architect and also the founder of the store, Ebenezer Way. This was a department store that lasted from 1864 until the 1950s, nearly 100 years. But Remember that the Eway & Co is not just for Ebenezer, because it was actually Emily who started the store, and she was one of the many women in Sydney who was running a business, not just for pin money. Thank you.